at timber frame details or timber framed wall sections, where we've been looking at how we can create a floor, a wall, and a roof in section. But the problem with the section is it's only one slice. It's a very small slice through the building, and we can sometimes misunderstand or miss some of that information. So what we're going to start looking at today is how can we understand this level of detail, but maybe in some other views as well. So we're going to create a timber framed shed, and we're going to draw all of the plans relevant in order to be able to not just explain it from an architectural point of view, but explain it basically as it would be built. So we're going to copy just this section to explain how this works. We could copy a little bit more if we wanted to, but that'll be fine for now. I might just grab one of these studs down the bottom. So we'll copy that, and we're going to make a new detail. So a new independent detail. Again, I'm doing this in a very, very 2D way. I know this isn't how you're supposed to draw in ArchiCAD or in Revit. The point of this is I'm trying to explain the elemental construction methodology of timber frame construction. And so we'll call this timber framed shed. Okay, let's paste this information here. So this starts as a wall section, but we're very quickly going to turn this into a floor plan to begin with. Now, when we're starting, it's always a question of, well, where do we start? What's the basis for what we're trying to do? And so typically we'll have an idea of the size of what we want to create. So I'm going to get my line tool, and right now I'll make it red, and I'm going to do it as a rotated rectangle. And the size of the shed that I want to make, I'll just zoom out for a second. Size of the shed that I want to make is 4,600 by 3,400. Now, we need to quickly understand, is that the outside of the slab? Is that the outside of the frame? Is that the outside of the cladding? Now, let's just assume that that's going to be the outside of the cladding. So that's the overall shed design. Then we'd have to ask, okay, well, what's the thickness of that cladding? Now, of course, what we have here is a very big build-up. This is a little bit too complicated or unjustifiably complicated for a shed. And so instead of having the batten and then the sarking and then the plywood and then the frame and then the plasterboard, we're going to have a frame and then the cladding fixed directly to the frame, of course, just with sarking in between, and then we'll have interior lining, and we won't do that out of plasterboard, we'll do that out of plywood. So if we just measure the cladding itself, so if I measure from the outside edge of this cladding to the inside edge of this cladding, which means I'm going at the worst case scenario, or another way of saying that would be the outside edge to the inside edge, that's 33 millimeters. So the next thing that I'm going to do is to select all of these lines. I'll offset this. Again, I'm doing this in red just to make it really easy to see. And that's going to be 33 millimeters. So that's the thickness that we've got for our cladding. We'll do that again. And eventually we're going to be deleting all of these red lines, just if you're wondering. I'm going to offset this again, and this is going to be 90 mil because this is the thickness of our frame. I'm not allowing for the sarking because that's less than a millimeter thick. Basically, we're squishing. I'm wanting to draw this correctly now, dimensionally correctly, not like a detail where I explode it. Because I want to be able to dimension it, I want those dimensions to make sense. So this might not look as pretty as the details that we've been looking, but I'm trying to make it a little bit more realistic. Well, dimensionally realistic might be another way of saying that. And then inside of that frame, we're then going to have lining, but I'm not going to worry about that at the moment. So the first thing we're going to start by doing is creating our frame, now that we've got the size of the frame. So I'm going to grab this piece of timber detail that I've created previously. So, and this is our stud. And so we've changed from this being a sectional view to a plan view. So this is now a piece of timber. At the moment, I'm just going to create this top wall. So I'll rotate this round. I'll move this into place. And I'm going to start by having a timber on the outside edge. Now I need to decide whether I want these timbers to be at an incremental center of 300 millimeters, 400 millimeters, 450 or 600. As I've talked about before, we generally try to work with a 300 millimeter increment for construction systems, building materials. Based on this very small building, such as a shed, I could probably get away with a 600 mil center, but because we're using a weatherboard on the outside, it's probably better to make it slightly smaller. Then I have to think, well, what's the interior lining going to be? I want the interior lining in this case to be fairly thin plywood, and so it also can't span a very long way. So it's better for me to use something like a 400 millimeter center so that I can have a piece of plywood that spans across it. Now, where would that piece of plywood sit? So if I pick up the settings of this plywood here, how big is a sheet of plywood? A sheet of plywood is 1200 millimeters long. Let's use rotated rectangular method, 1200, and we'll make it 12 millimeters thick in this case. So that's our piece of plywood. I'll just turn off the construction method, make that simple. Yep. So the idea is that I want my studs to relate to this piece of plywood. Now, if I was to do this properly, I'm then going to multiply that, drag multiple copies. I want a piece of plywood. So that's coming in 3.5 sheets. That's how much plywood it's going to take to do this. Now, if I was being really thoughtful, I'd just keep this bit of plywood over here, and then I could try to add that somewhere else later. So I have to zoom in a bit more so you can see it. 1, 2, 3, 4. Now, for this to work well, I will also therefore need to have one of these timber studs joining, so the center of it, let's change this to half. So the center of this stud aligning over the center of this plywood join. Let's do that again. Drag multiple copies. Center of this stud aligning over the center of that join. Center of stud, center of join. In addition to the centers, I also need it to go over the end. So I need a stud in the corner, but I'll also need a stud here. I'll also need a stud here. And of course, what you're going to see soon is that when we rotate this copy, this is going to apply all the way around our building. It's not just on one side. So we've got a stud, we've got a stud. What's the space between? So from the center of this to the center of this is 1178. From the center of this to the center of this is 1200. Now I could make this work a little bit better by moving this back 45. So if I was to do that, that would make a bit more sense, because now 45, center to center is 1200. And that's still giving me enough room in order to be able to fix my studs. So if I do that, I've got a nice standardized detail where I've got studs at 1200 centers at the moment, and they're supporting the ends of each of these sheets. Now, like I said, 1200 is far too wide. 600 is probably still a little bit too wide. So the next space down would be 400 centers. So I'll grab this, move, multiply, spread, 400. Let's measure it to make sure that worked. So from middle to middle, 400, middle to middle, 400, middle to middle, 400. So now we've got a regular spacing for our studs. We'll do the same thing. This time I'll just do it a little bit faster. I'll select both of these, move, multiply. Of course, I'm doing this slowly, or we could say the long way round, because I'm trying to explain why I'm doing it, not just how I'm doing it. Let's do this again. In this case, I'm going to go from left to right, because it won't work perfectly, but I don't really mind if I have a closer stud at some point. So multiply again, 400 centers. 1, where would the second one be? So I don't need that second one, right? Because I have a smaller gap here than I have over here. Let's copy this one to the end, move, drag a copy. And I've now got all of the studs that I need in order to be able to explain how I would construct this wall. If I'm really clever, what I can do is to select all of these. Maybe I could group it together, or mirror a copy. And now I've very quickly replicated what I have on the other side. Now this isn't perfect, but it's a good way to start, because what we're going to add a little bit later on is a window into this. Let's do this again. Make this a little bit easier. This time I'll go mirror a copy. Going to mirror around 45 degrees. I'll just explain this by doing it wrong to begin with, and then I'll adjust it as necessary. So I need to decide whether I want it to be correct at the top or the bottom. Again, it doesn't really matter. In this case, I'm going to assume that I'm making it correct from the bottom and then working up the page. So I don't need and can't have two studs, two pieces of timber over the top of each other. So therefore I'll get rid of that one. This one also can't sit here, so it needs to move to here. This plywood also can't go over the top of the other piece of plywood, so it needs to move to there. So by the time I move all of these things, it's slightly changing the way it's actually going to work. And so then we'll need to reset or recenter some of these, because it's now unjustifiable for the way it's been set up. So there's our plywood. So rather than, we can see that this one here works, so, but it's in the wrong place. So we'll get rid of all of these, because we can see that as we go along, none of these really make sense as to where they're going to sit. So rather than trying to figure out each one individually, we'll just start from the beginning. So this sheet, let's measure it. We need this sheet to still be 1200 long. 1200, so that's fine. So then we can take this stud, copy it to where? To the center. And I'm going to work back and forward from this point. Move, multiply, 400, 400. Now if I look at this very carefully, if I placed another one at 400, of course it's going to be centered on the middle of the end of the sheet. I don't want that. I'm okay with leaving the other one as it is, so that's why I used that in its position. Now I can continue on from here, so I could copy these all the way through, which I'll do now. Move, drag a copy. Move, drag a copy. Now we see that this is also not working at the end, which is fine. So we're going to chop this bit of ply. Now again, if I wanted to try to be really conservative, I could move that bit of ply over here, and then I could remember that these are the leftover bits of ply that I'm going to have. This stud doesn't need to go there, so I'm going to move this stud back to there, and it's supporting the end of this ply, it's supporting this wall, it's working well. So I can delete that. Now once that's done, I can copy this again, copy these timbers, copy this ply, move, mirror a copy from the center to the center, and we see that that works perfectly on the other side now as well. So I've created a framed wall. Now, of course, the point is that all of these ones, this is one framed wall, and this is going to make a bit more sense when we draw this in elevation. That's a framed wall. That's a framed wall. And of course the other ones are corresponding the same. And so we've got 4 walls. We would create these frames either in place, or more commonly we'd create them lying down and then we'd tilt it up into place. So again, I'm talking from an architect's point of view or a building designer's point of view, but I'm trying to explain it from a carpenter's point of view. We want to understand how a builder would be building this. And therefore we want to try to design it or draw it. In this case, it's a lot of detail. It's a lot more detail than we'd need to show a carpenter. They could normally figure this out, but of course we want to explain this, or I want to explain this so that you understand how the framing system works. All right, I'll stop for a bit now. The next thing that we're going to do in the next tutorial is then have a look at, well, what happens when we want to break this system? What happens when we want to add in a window? What happens when we want to add into a door? How do we adjust this frame in order to make it work?